Number 1. I was 20 years old and I had never had a boyfriend. I was a shy girl who grew up in a small town where dating options were limited, so I spent most of my time trying to find a significant other on online dating sites. I met a few people, but being paranoid about the whole meeting in real life thing prevented me from ever asking anyone out on a date. Then I met Mike. Mike seemed perfect. He was my age, we shared the same interests, and we had the same sense of humour. Our conversations quickly moved from OkCupid chat rooms to texting to actually talking on the phone. We did phone chats for about a month, through which I learned he was a medical student, he owned his own IT computer repair shop, and he had his own apartment. At the end of the month, he finally convinced me to meet him in real life. For our first date, we arranged to meet for lunch in the food court of a mall, then go see a movie. I didn't tell my friends or family where I was going because I was embarrassed to admit I was going on an OkCupid date, so I tried to make our date setting as public as possible. It ended up being one of the best dates of my life. We got so involved in our conversation that we missed the movie and ended up walking around inside the mall till it got dark. He wanted to head out to the parking lot to sit in his car and continue the discussion, but it was getting late and I had to get home, so I passed. I couldn't wait for our next date. I wanted a boyfriend so badly, and I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this way about a guy, so I eagerly agreed to his plans for our next date. We were going to meet at his apartment for dinner. I naively thought that, since I already met him once, I didn't need to worry about telling anyone I'd be out with him that night. After what came next, I never made that mistake again. I was on my way to his place on the evening of our date when he texted me that he was working late at his computer repair shop and asked me if I could come meet him there instead. The address he texted for his shop was about 2 hours away from the address he'd given me for his apartment, but I was already on the road and I was desperate to make this work, so I didn't mind. The first red flag went off when I arrived. His shop was a tiny one-room building, not far off from being a shack. It was on a woodsy residential street outside of town and had no sign. Inside the shack, it was even worse. Computer parts were scattered all over the floor, nothing looked client-facing, and the carpet reeked of smoke and weed. He also didn't look like he was working at all. He was sitting with a group of older men who looked to be in their 40s, passing around a pipe. He introduced them as his friends. We hung out with them for about 20 minutes, during which none of them spoke to me or acknowledged me. After passing the pipe around a couple more times, Mike offered to drive me to his apartment. I told him I could drive myself, but he insisted he drive because he only had one parking spot. I reluctantly agreed, reminding myself that our first date went great, so I could trust him. At first, I couldn't even tell it was an apartment. We had arrived in a parking lot of a small hair salon called Salon True, closed for the night, which had plenty of empty parking spaces. He showed me to a door beneath the salon, which led to the basement of the building. Inside was a medium-sized cement room with nothing but an industrial sink, a pair of weighted dumbbells, a foam mat, and no windows. The only decoration he had was a bobblehead of a character from a show I told him I liked that looked brand new. I would have considered the idea that maybe he was struggling financially and had lied about everything because he was embarrassed about his financial situation. But then I saw the giant flat-screen TV and DV camera up against the wall. He closed the door behind us, and I watched helplessly as he closed the abnormal number of locks on it. He must have seen my fear because he quickly assured me that the reason he had so many locks was because the hairdressers upstairs hated him for no reason and had tried to enter his apartment on multiple occasions. At this point, every possible alarm was going off in my head. I was locked in a basement with no car and no one knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. But there was one thing I could still try. He walked across the room, his back towards me, and bent down to pick up one of his weighted dumbbells. While his back was turned, I pulled my iPhone slightly out of my pocket and booted up a game that had a song that sounded like a ringtone, then shoved it back in my pocket. When he turned back to look at me, the phone in my pocket appeared to be ringing, I answered the phone, pretending it was my dad, and faked that phone conversation like my life depended on it. My dad was mad at me for being out so late and demanded to know where I was. I told him the name of the salon and the name of the town we were in. I made it seem like he knew exactly where Salon True was. He told me to come home immediately or he would come get me. When I hung up, Mike was already unlocking the door. We got in his car and he drove back to the computer shop much faster than before. He dropped me off at my car, apologised and said he would text me about our next date. I'd never been so happy to be back in my own car. A few days later, he hadn't contacted me yet, so I tried calling him for an explanation. His service had been disconnected. Later that day, I told the story to my good friend Eric and tried to bring up Mike's OkCupid profile page, but that had been deleted too. However, I was lame, and when we were calling each other regularly, I had his OkCupid picture saved in my phone as his contact picture. I showed it to Eric and he recognised Mike immediately. My friend Eric was a student employee at the IT department in his university who helped other students with computer issues. Eric said Mike would come in frequently to get viruses taken off his laptop. Viruses that often looked like they were from really sketchy porn sites. And his name wasn't Mike. Eric was able to use info he had gathered about this guy from the IT department ticketing system to look him up on the school's database. Turns out he wasn't a med student at all. He was older than he said he was. He had dropped out of school this semester, and, since he had to bring his laptop to another student to get it fixed, he clearly did not own an IT computer repair business. I'm glad we never met again. Number 2. Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested we meet up in person. She invited me to this coffee shop, and I accepted. However, the day of the meetup, she started messaging me saying she had to tell me something. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me though and begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and continued on with life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed cool and fun and we hit it off. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. Weeks later, I would realise that this new girl was the same girl as the week before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure, as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe, and the next day I sat at the table waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed, and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out the window and saw, from across the street, a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds, and looked back. He was still standing there staring. At that point, I left the cafe, got on my bike, I always bike everywhere, and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together and reasoned that no one could have followed me. I then deleted my Tinder profile, and things were normal for a few weeks. About 3 weeks later, I started getting phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out. After about a day, I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. I then started receiving texts. At first they were pretty harmless, calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. It then changed to very sexual texts, until eventually the messages became threatening, and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and whereabouts, saying she would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number. But when I called phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced and that it was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks, not responding to the texts, thinking I shouldn't feed the troll, but eventually it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 to 20 texts every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The texting and calls stopped for a while, but sure enough it started happening again. I called my phone provider asking if they ever gave out numbers at a user's request, and they said their policy stated that they wouldn't, couldn't unless valid identification was provided. Then one day I tried logging into my Facebook, but was denied. Within a day, friends started contacting me asking what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mum who died years ago. I apologised profusely and told people what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again, at which point I deactivated it for a while. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything but told me since I or any of my relatives and friends were in no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker. I decided against it, however, and I just hoped it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts and phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but some of my closest friends received the occasional text as well, which weirded us all out. I hated that they got dragged into it. One day I came home and things felt very eerie. Door unlocked, windows open, and no one home. A strong breeze running through the apartment. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls, texts have more or less stopped. I'll get an occasional text, but at most one every 2 weeks. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more weary of the people around me and my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until this stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are getting back to normal, and at this point I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say all dating apps are dangerous and no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone, FaceTime them first, Skype, anything. I was naive about it, and I regret it. Be safe, stick close to your friends, and try meeting people in more traditional ways. Weird Tinder stalker, let's not meet. Number 3. A few years ago, I was at one of the lowest points in my life. My wife had left me, so I was alone, heartbroken and depressed. I don't have many friends, so I had nowhere to go. I would just walk around stores for hours, so I wouldn't have to be at home by myself thinking about how shitty my life was. I very nearly committed suicide on more than one occasion, but somehow talked myself out of it. During this time, I happened across an adult webcam site that I would hang out on, not only for the obvious reason, but also because you could actually chat with people. Eventually, I started broadcasting myself. If you've never been to one of these sites, think Twitch, but with nudity. People can view your cam, tip you, and subscribe to be notified when you're online. I didn't have many people in my room at first, but eventually I started getting a few anonymous viewers, and it was kind of exciting that someone was watching me. Before long, I was up to dozens of viewers and some subscribers. I even started getting some tips and making a little money doing something that, let's face it, I was going to do every evening anyway. It was mostly guys watching me, of course, but although I'm straight, it didn't bother me too much. It gave me people to talk to at least. I would, however, get females sometimes, or at least guys saying they were female from time to time. Eventually a girl named Brit started stopping by regularly. She was different than most of the people I'd met on the site because she actually seemed interested in talking to me, and I of course enjoyed the attention. Whenever she stopped by, the whole room would become a lot more fun. We started private messaging, and I even made her a moderator for my room. She asked me if I'd Kik, which at the time I'd never even heard of, but she explained it was a texting app that you don't have to give out your number to use, so we started chatting offline using it. We would talk for hours. I found out she lived halfway across the country, which I actually liked because there would be no pressure to meet in person right away. We sent pictures, she was very attractive, and at some point began sexting with one another. Even though I doubted much would ever really come of it, It was great for me because it gave me someone to talk to, and it was really helping me rebuild my shattered self-esteem and confidence. This went on for a few months, and eventually we started talking less and less. I'd kind of expected that this wasn't going to go anywhere, so it didn't bother me when we stopped responding altogether. I had never held any illusions that this was going to be a long-term relationship. I figured she'd found someone real near her and decided that someone she could actually be with was better than a long-distance fling with someone she'd never met in person. It was fine. By this point I had met a few girls myself, so I wasn't too upset. I did miss chatting with her sometimes because I'd really enjoyed talking to her and she'd been there for me during a pretty dark time. Anyway, I went on with my life and started dating someone, and we ended up going on a trip to the beach together. A couple of days after I got back, I got a message from Brit asking if I was in Florida. What the fuck? How would she know I was in Florida? I said no, but I had been there last week. She said she was there now and we must have just missed each other. We talked for a bit, she asked me where I had stayed and told me she was just down the street from that hotel. When I told her that I had been there with someone, she got pretty upset and then stopped messaging me again. I was a little confused and more than a little weirded out that she had known where I'd been, but I didn't think too much of it. I told myself it must have just been a strange coincidence and forgot about it. Then things took a turn for the worse. A few weeks later, I got another message from Brit late at night after my girlfriend had gone to sleep. Who the fuck is she? I had no idea how to respond to her. I asked her what the fuck she was talking about, and she went on to describe my girlfriend and ask me why I thought I could get away with cheating on her. I was literally floored. Not only had I never been in an actual relationship with Brit, I had never even met her in person. On top of that, she'd stopped speaking to me for months, and now suddenly she knew what my girlfriend looked like and was accusing me of cheating on her? I expressed all this to her and then asked her how she knew what my girlfriend looked like, thinking she was Facebook stalking me or something. Her reply made my jaw drop and felt like somebody had just tossed a brick into the pit of my stomach. Because I can see her in your fucking bed. I immediately closed the blinds and checked the house and made sure the doors and windows were locked. I told her that we had never been in a relationship and that we were most definitely not in one now. I asked her to please leave me alone and not contact me again. She just responded, "Lol," and a smiley face. It was at this point that I noticed the light on my webcam was on. She had somehow hacked into my computer and turned my fucking webcam on. I unplugged it and threw it in the closet. Brit then sent me another message. "Aw, you're no fun anymore." I reiterated that this was unacceptable. I did not want to talk to her again, and that if she didn't leave me alone, I would contact the police. Then I blocked her from every form of communication I ever had used with her, and uninstalled Kik. The next day I had my cable company change my IP address, and I haven't heard from her since. But I'm still paranoid that this isn't over. So crazy sexting internet stalker, let's not meet again. Lady Hallow here. Thanks for listening. If you have a story to share, or just want to get in contact with me, the links are in the description. And until next time, sweet dreams.